So students from Washington, congratulations on making it to day 3 of the competition. That's a really big deal. So congratulations to you for making it this far along. We're excited to hear your presentation this afternoon. In just a moment, I will have the judges introduce themselves, and then they'll ask you to introduce yourselves and your teacher. And then you all know the drill. They'll read you the question, and then we'll hear your response, and we'll have some Q&A with 2 bonus minutes today. I'll just point out that if you happen to be in a position that you're mid-sentence when I hold up time, please go ahead and finish your sentence, okay? All right, so with that, I will mute myself and hand things over to the judges.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Miriam Mamar-Sadeghi. I am serving on the board of the Center for Civic Education currently. I judge this every year. I participated in We the People as a student the very first year it was offered on the bicentennial of the US Constitution many, many years ago. And I have spent most of my career providing opportunities for civic education, civil society capacity building to people living in not free countries, including Iran, where I'm originally from.
My name is Sue Leeson. I'm a senior justice on the Oregon Supreme Court.
I'm Tim Moore, and I'm from the Center for Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin.
Could you all introduce yourselves, please, and your teacher?
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Elise Norris, and my favorite philosopher is John Locke for his theory of social contract and his second treatise of government.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Maya Cheem, and my favorite philosopher is Montesquieu for his thoughts on separation of power in government.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Makai Owens. My favorite philosopher is Aristotle for his books on Nicomachean ethics and their connection to politics. On behalf of Tahoma Senior High School, our advisor, Gretchen Wolfing, and Washington State, we thank you for judging us today.
Thank you. Thank you, teacher. I will read the question. We are Unit 1, Philosophical and Historical Foundations of the American Political System. Question starts with a quote from Benjamin Rush. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Please begin.
We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Thomas Paine. Revolutionary principles from the Enlightenment period heavily influenced the founding documents of the American government. The principles are defined as revolutionary because the American values were drastically different from its mother country, Great Britain. The founders adopted Aristotle's concept of politia as a written constitution that served to embody fundamental laws and held power above the government that greatly differed from other governmental forms.
American governance was an operation dependent on its constitution rather than the constitution being an operation of government like in Great Britain. This allowed for the government to be based on principles rather than old customs and traditions. The amendment process could be implemented, and the government was given space to change and match the needs of the time, reflecting the dynamics of the tumultuous Enlightenment period.
Another revolutionary idea implemented in the Constitution was the separation of powers. Baron de Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, highlighted the need for separation of power, stating, "There is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from legislative and executive power." The largest impact this idea had on the founders was extracting the executive from the legislature, as seen through the first 2 articles of the Constitution. This, paired with checks and balances, was revolutionary, as government would no longer be based solely on social hierarchy.
These changes satisfied the demands of the colonists, who wanted direct representation rather than the virtual representation in Parliament that Britain had been using. The basis of American constitutionalism developed the principle that the people need to be directly represented in their legislatures.
The consent of the governed can present various problems, for instance, slowing the process to create or amend a constitution, thus rendering it ineffective. This consent is derived from the theory of social contract found in John Locke's second treatise of government, where the citizens give their consent by giving up some rights to have the protection of others. This can be troublesome as each citizen holds their own beliefs. The great disparity of ideology between people makes the amendment process and creation of government a long procedure. This is shown through the early history of our amendment process, averaging a period of 2 years before time limitations were imposed on ratification.
Despite potential compromises, another issue presents itself as the term consent of the governed does not encompass all voices. Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, describes the challenge of creating a national document for a diverse citizenry. During the founding period, consent of the governed meant the consent of white landowning men rather than the consent of everyone under the government's jurisdiction. As the United States has evolved into the diverse nation that it is today, it prioritizes the consent of the majority over the consent of the governed.
Lippmann describes modern political interest as concerned in public affairs but completely immersed in private ones. This leaves the voices of minorities, immigrants, disenfranchised groups, and others left out of the conversation of consent. Despite extensive efforts for inclusion by widespread movements over the last 2 centuries, it is evident that the United States will never fully attain the revolutionary ideal of absolute consent to the governed.
Revolutionary principles are present today as seen through the motives of modern-day activism. Similar to the American colonists' claim to a right to revolution and a list of grievances, the same rights are posed today with the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Inhibiting insular areas from statehood aligns with the original grievances of taxation without proper representation in the national government. Furthermore, explicit violations of people's rights would mean that they have the right to alter or abolish their government and create a new system to better meet their needs under the social contract theory.
The Yes California movement to secede California, also known as Colexit, demonstrates the use of the revolutionary principle, that being the right to secede, in a modern day context. However, the movement's justification did not match the ones used during the revolution. With anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million supporters, this movement embodies the revolutionary principle of secession.
Through these forms of advocacy of governmental change, revolutionary principles have been embodied by American citizens.
Thank you. Right on time. Okay. I don't know if that was meant to be your last sentence, but it was perfectly timed. Okay. Absolute consent. Is that even possible? And what do you see as the most salient threats to absolute consent today in today's America?
I don't believe that absolute consent is fully achievable. I think that it is impossible to really even consider that as a possibility. I think that no matter what, there will be people that disagree, or there will be people that do not even voice their opinions. And I feel that one of the biggest threats to this is disenfranchisement of certain minorities or groups of people. If their voices are not allowed to be heard or presented, then they do not really consent.
Is consent the same thing as opinion?
No, I don't think so. I think that consent is more of an agreement to, like the social contract theory under John Locke, he states that it's that agreement between government and the people in the conversation of rights and protections. And while you may not agree with what's going on, as long as your opinions may not match that agreement, it is okay to agree with it. I just don't think that everyone will agree.
Okay, so we all go out and vote, and then some of us get the person that we wanted to win in office, but that doesn't mean that we haven't all consented to this form of government, right? We are represented, even if the person that we wanted to win doesn't win.
Correct.
Can you say more about how we can make sure that we have consent in today's America? What are the biggest threats to it?
To provide a different perspective, first answering your first question, I would disagree with my colleague in saying that that idea of absolute consent of the governed is possible. Although it wouldn't be a great form of government. Looking to Aristotle in his book Politics, he speaks on deviant and correct forms of government, and to find a true absolute consent of the governed would be giving power directly to the people and giving an absolute democracy. And to provide the answer to your second question and a solution, I would say widely in media and perspective. Looking at Walter Lippmann's argument, the reason why it's hard to find a absolute consent of governed in our diverse citizenry is due to media and perspective. It's hard for me to understand as a voter what's going on in Wyoming or Florida to be able to truly vote with them or understand what's going on in those states.
Expanding on my colleague, it would be good to fully recreate the 1965 Voting Act in order to stop the voter suppression that occurs. And also it would be very prudent to possibly change the policy about incarcerated persons losing their right to vote, because 6.2% of African Americans in the United States have lost their vote. They've been disenfranchised due to incarceration. And while this does fall under them violating the social contract, it is important that not all crimes are treated the same way. So for minor offenses, such as maybe minor drug possession, it should not be treated the same way as murder. And those people should still have the right to vote because they do still fall under the jurisdiction of the United States government.
I think very quickly in our history, this idea of the American Revolution came up, and the Anti-Federalists accused the Federalists of sabotaging the American Revolution. What's their argument against the Federalists that they're that bad?
The Anti-Federalists were very fearful of a strong central government, where the Federalists were strong advocates for it. I believe Alexander Hamilton himself said that he wanted only a national government without any sort of state governments by themselves. I think that in terms of the revolution, the Federalists were trying to bring in certain principles and have their own version of a constitution that greatly differed from what the Anti-Federalists believed.
In your opening statement, you said that we have a government based on principles, not practice, but didn't elaborate on the principles, jumped right to consent. Would you say more about the principles as opposed to practice?
Absolutely. So some of the really foundational principles of our government is our individual rights, as we see in the Bill of Rights, but furthermore, in the Constitution by itself, we have the importance of separation of government. Montesquieu, his thoughts on separation of government was laid out by in Spirit of the Laws, was really highly valued by many of the founders, and that comes with the creation of the executive, legislature, and judicial, as we see in the first, second, and third articles of the Constitution.
So separation of powers and Bill of Rights, are those the principles that are different from British practice?
Yes, in that sense, we have the exposition of natural rights, which was not as highly valued. That philosophy which was not as highly valued by the British government, as we see with the Magna Carta and the rights of the Englishmen. It really took many, many centuries to have fully developed natural rights in Britain, and in the United States, it highly differed because we started right off the bat with the prioritization of those natural rights.
Thank you.
So what's the big difference? Rights are rights, aren't they?
The large difference, I would say, is how they're given and how they're protected. We can see this in the idea of privacy. Within our Fourth Amendment, we hold very dearly the privacy of the American people. We can see this with the abolishment of FISA courts when the whole Snowden disaster occurred and revealing that people's communications were tapped. And that was a large priority. Whereas on the flip side, if you look to Britain, they're actually having a crisis of privacy because they have a large amount of CCTV cameras stationed all through plazas. And with the improvement of technology, they're actually gaining facial recognition software, causing concern for privacy of their citizens.
Another difference in rights can be seen between positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights being those that the government provides services and helps the citizens, while negative rights are limits on the government to protect the rights of citizens. And that is the negative rights are more commonly seen in the Bill of Rights with freedom of speech, and you could nearly point to any amendment for that one.
Okay, how about social media today? Do you see this, and more broadly, our more technological age, the way that our public square has changed? Do you see this as opportunities, threats? How do you assess where we are now with regards to consent and how technology impacts that?
I say it is a strong danger to the ideas of consent of the governed, although in the eyes of Aristotle, the access of knowledge and the ideas and being able to be more informed in a political sense is wonderful. The ideas of misinformation or the idea of a community is broken. When you look to classical republicanism and civic virtue, those were created more in the idea of small communities. So casting this wide net and having misinformation or things that cater to your own views, I feel are largely negative to the American populace.
To disagree with my colleague, I would say that while social media can present a danger, the way that it is so widespread and how it connects nearly anyone who participates in it is also inevitable. I think that you have to look to the positive side of things on social media and just seeing that it creates that larger discussion among people. I think this is especially true for younger generations. You can see on TikTok, there's political accounts, hundreds of them. On Instagram, on Facebook, on anything you look to, there's always discussions on politics and what people think. And I think one of the real dangers would just be privacy or just how people's freedom of speech is altered on social media. I think that that's the trickiest topic when it comes to that. But that discussion, I think, is crucial. And I think it's one of the most positive things about social media.
Well, but going back to Aristotle, is speech an end in itself, or is speech a means by which human beings acquire truth through inquiry?
Looking to the idea of Plato, just to respond to that question, in his play Menos, where he speaks on education and learning, he speaks not inherently on speech, but how we learn, saying that red is red because it's red, rather than saying it's a combination of these colors or understanding what color it is. So speech inherently does not provide knowledge, but that understanding and that next step does.
Do you think there's a difference between how revolutionary, let me read, sorry. Can reform movements be revolutionary?
Absolutely. As we've seen following the Civil War with the Reformation period and the entire civil rights movement that followed after, we had the addition of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and it really served to protect against disenfranchisement for people of color in America.
Okay, great. That was time, right? Okay, thank you. All right. You guys had a lot of grace. You worked well together as a team. You had a real comfort. Elise, I felt like, as you were answering, for example, the question about social media and technology, you had already thought well about the issues, and not just in relation to this question, but, it's like you've traversed the terrain in general and probably the other units with other members of your team. It seemed like you brought Unit 1 to all the other units as you were speaking. I felt that way. You guys have a lot to be proud of. And I would love to hear, after we hear from the other judges, what schools you guys are going to be going to.
I'm quite smitten with the fact that you, in much of your presentation, you point out dilemmas. One of the first ones you mentioned is the Lockean dilemma of consent. The dilemma of how far activism, how far you go before you quit the country, or you quit California. Being from the Midwest, we would recommend that everybody quit California, but that's beside the point. My point being that I think it's interesting when these panels, these students recognize dilemmas, and first of all, I'm struck by you acknowledging the importance of that and facing it, that these are dilemmas, and it's an ongoing question as to how do we temporarily resolve those and move forward. So I thought that was actually a strength of your presentation. Also a strength of your presentation, that Hamilton wants to obliterate the states. Just little factoids like that I think are important to your presentation. And also your discussion on positive and negative liberty. And their rights are not rights, I think is how it was stated. So so this is they're very thoughtful presentation, and your embracing of seemingly contradictory or dilemmas within our system is a highlight for me when I look at this presentation. Thank you very much. My favorite philosopher is Ziggy, the cartoon. But
Yeah, that was a very engaging conversation. We really appreciate it. I'm a little confused about the principles being largely Enlightenment principles, but also relying on Aristotelian principles. There was just for me some confusion there. And as a student of classical political philosophy, I love the idea that maybe Plato and Aristotle haven't been exiled completely, but I think the Enlightenment kind of did. So anyway, and I also appreciated the fact that there are a whole lot of ambiguities that you're aware of. I would have loved some help in how I can go about resolving those ambiguities. Consent is never going to be achieved completely. No taxation without representation. So Puerto Rico, DC should be admitted as states. I don't know if we're throwing California out or California is seceding. We can have that discussion. In Oregon, we're ready to boot Texas. We're not even waiting for them to secede, but in any event, there were just some places where it would have been really helpful to get your thinking on how do we resolve some of these dilemmas, or how do we just continue to live with them? A couple places where I might pick on you a little bit. You say rights are given, not by governments, thank you. We never, ever look to government to give us rights. We look to governments to protect our inalienable rights. And when people say, well, the Constitution, this particular amendment gave somebody something. Oh, no, it didn't. And it's not phrased that way. It says no state shall prohibit. I hope you know that you're on CCTV the minute you enter the District of Columbia. You're on CCTV when you enter most large cities in this country. We have not solved the problems that the British are dealing with there. And I didn't know FISA courts had been abolished. I thought I know a judge who still serves on one, but those are just factoids, I guess. The place I guess I would leave you to think about is, Aristotle warned against techne, taking over the human mind, that how we do something, the means by which we do something becomes more important to the human mind than why we're doing it. And I think that may be the crisis that we have arrived at with social media. We're so engaged in the how we can get more and better and so on that we stopped asking, why are we doing this? Especially with respect to the aid of free speech, which is not an end in itself, I don't think. It's a means of making the human mind better, more inquisitive, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, really nice presentation, tons for us to think about.